Elijah Rivers had always flown under the radar in Miss Thornton's 6th grade class at Jefferson Middle School in Little Rock, Arkansas. He wasn't shy, nor was he inattentive. He just wasn't the kind of student Miss Thornton noticed, or rather, the kind she wanted to notice. Her style of ignoring Elijah wasn't overt, it was subtle, almost methodical. When his hand shot up, she'd scan the room and call on someone else. If he answered correctly, she moved on without acknowledgement. If he stumbled, she lingered. "She barely even looks at you," Tyler Whitman, his desk neighbor, had whispered once. "You got teacher invisibility or something." Elijah had only shrugged. "Guess so." But something shifted that Thursday morning. Miss Thornton glanced his way more than usual, her expression unreadable but somehow expectant. Elijah noticed but didn't react. He focused on his worksheet, pencil tapping rhythmically against his desk, an old habit that his mother always told him to break but helped him think. Then it happened. "Elijah," Miss Thornton's voice rang out. Crisp. Controlled. "Why don't you answer this one?" Heads turned. Elijah blinked, momentarily stunned. She never called on him, ever. Straightening in his seat, he glanced at the board. General Sherman's march to the sea was a military campaign aimed at breaking the Confederacy's resources and morale. She said, the word drawn out like she was testing its weight. Not bad. For a fleeting moment, the usual classroom chatter died down as a few students exchanged glances. Tyler raised an eyebrow at him. The day should have ended there, but Miss Thornton wasn't done. As the bell rang and students began to pack their bags, her voice cut through the shuffle. "Elijah, stay behind for a moment." Curiosity flared among the departing students, but no one lingered long enough to see what would unfold. Slowly, Elijah approached her desk, unsure what to expect. "I overheard you the other day," she began, her hands clasped together on the desk. "You mentioned your grandfather. A musician, wasn't he?" Elijah frowned. "Yeah. He was a jazz pianist." "Why?" Her smile tightened, more a challenge than a gesture of kindness. "Let's see what you've learned from him. Tomorrow, you'll play for the class." "What?" Elijah's voice barely rose above a whisper, but the disbelief was unmistakable. "You heard me." She gestured to the old upright piano collecting dust in the back corner of the room. "We'll all see if music runs in the family." Elijah spent the night replaying the conversation. He knew what this was, a setup. Miss Thornton didn't expect him to impress anyone. She expected him to stumble, to confirm whatever assumptions she had made about him. But she didn't know everything. The next day, whispers followed Elijah as he walked into class. "You gonna play today?" Brandon Hall smirked from across the room. Miss Thornton started the lesson as if it were any other day, but her attention drifted toward Elijah more than once. Finally, as the hour wound down, she closed her book with deliberate care. "We've got a little extra time today," she announced, her eyes landing on him. "Perfect." She turned toward the piano. "Elijah, let's see what you've got." A hush fell over the room. Elijah could feel every gaze on him, hear every shuffle and whispered comment. Slowly, he stood and walked to the piano. It was old, its keys yellowed with age, a few chipped at the edges. "Play whatever you'd like," Miss Thornton said, her hands clasped in front of her. Elijah ran his fingers over the keys, feeling the slight unevenness of an instrument long out of tune. His heart wasn't racing, but his determination burned steady and fierce. He inhaled, placed his hands on the keys, and began to play. At first, the students leaned back, expecting something clunky, amateurish. But as Elijah's fingers moved deftly across the keys, the room shifted. A melodic, jazz-infused piece filled the air, bold yet intricate. It wasn't a beginner's attempt, it was a performance. Miss Thornton's expression shifted from smug anticipation to visible shock. Her lips parted slightly, and for the first time, she seemed at a loss for words. Elijah didn't stop to look at her. He didn't need to. The silence in the room, the stunned faces of his classmates, and the music echoing in the small classroom spoke louder than anything else. When he finished, he stood, adjusted the bench, and met Miss Thornton's wide-eyed stare with a quiet, steady gaze. "Anything else?" he asked, his voice calm but resolute. Miss Thornton said nothing. She couldn't. Elijah placed his fingers on the keys. They felt familiar, though this piano was nothing like the one at home. His grandfather's piano was warm and resonant, with a sound that wrapped around you like a favorite blanket. This one was stiff, its soundboard warped by years of neglect. Still, it would do. He took a deep breath. The room had fallen silent, a mix of curiosity and skepticism hanging thick in the air. Some students leaned forward for the spectacle, others sat back, smirking, ready to enjoy his failure. Elijah blocked them out. The first few notes trickled softly into the room, a blues progression his grandfather had played countless times on humid Arkansas afternoons. The melody was steady and sure, his left hand anchoring the rhythm as his right danced across the keys. Confidence bloomed in the music, silencing the whispers and drawing every eye to him. Miss Thornton, arms crossed, furrowed her brow. She had expected stumbles, perhaps a timid attempt to save face. What she heard instead was precision, passion, and control. But Elijah wasn't playing for her, nor for the class. He played for himself, and for his grandfather. He sank into the music, letting the piano tell a story only he understood. Then he pushed further, transitioning into a complex progression that his grandfather had painstakingly taught him. It was a piece he had struggled with for months before finally mastering it. The notes rolled together seamlessly, each chord striking with purpose, the melody soaring over a deep, pulsing bassline. The weight of the music settled over the room. Tyler leaned forward, wide-eyed. Brandon, who had earlier cracked a joke, now sat frozen, arms crossed but expression unreadable. A girl in the back, Madison, watched intently, her usual disinterest replaced with reluctant admiration. The crescendo hit, a wave of sound that seemed to fill every crack and corner of the room. Elijah pressed into the keys, the music carrying all the unspoken frustrations, doubts, and defiance he had bottled up. Then, the final note, a rich, resonant sound, hung in the air, lingering long after his fingers lifted from the keys. Silence. For a moment, no one moved. Then, a single clap echoed from the back of the room, quickly joined by another and another. Soon, the classroom erupted in applause. Tyler let out a low whistle. "Damn." Brandon shook his head slightly, muttering, "I didn't know he could do that." Elijah sat back, his hands resting on his lap. He didn't smile, didn't bask in the moment. He just breathed, letting the applause wash over him. Miss Thornton, however, remained frozen. She stood by her desk, arms crossed, lips pressed together, her face unreadable. As the applause faded, she finally spoke. "Well," she said, her voice clipped. "That was unexpected." The class quieted, a few students still murmuring or exchanging glances. "Where did you learn to play like that?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. Elijah met her gaze without flinching. "My grandfather." Something flickered in her expression, doubt, recognition, or maybe unease. But it disappeared as quickly as it had come. "I see," she said, straightening. A pause. Then, as if snapping herself back into control, she addressed the room. "All right, let's get back to our lesson." But the room didn't move. Tyler raised an eyebrow at Elijah. Madison leaned back, looking almost disappointed that the moment had ended. Brandon scoffed audibly. "That's it," he muttered. Miss Thornton's gaze snapped to him. "Excuse me." Brandon shrugged, gesturing vaguely toward the piano. "He just played like something you'd hear on TV, and you're just gonna move on." A few heads nodded in quiet agreement. Miss Thornton's mouth tightened. "This is a classroom, not a talent show." Elijah, still seated, spoke calmly. "You didn't think I could play, did you?" Her eyes darted back to him, sharp and assessing. "That's why you called me up here," he continued, his voice steady. The murmurs started again, rippling through the room. Miss Thornton's fingers curled slightly against the edge of her desk. "That's enough, Elijah." But he wasn't done. "You wouldn't have asked Tyler," he said, glancing at his friend. "Or Madison. Or Brandon. But you asked me. Why?" The room held its collective breath, the air thick with unspoken tension. Miss Thornton's jaw tightened. "You're out of line." "I don't think I am." Her posture stiffened, her authority visibly wavering. "Sit down." For the first time all year, Elijah didn't immediately obey. He stood slowly, scanning the room, the students who had once overlooked him, the ones who had doubted him, the ones who had smirked at the challenge. Then, finally, he turned and returned to his seat. The silence lingered, charged and electric. Miss Thornton, usually so composed, looked unsettled. For once, the control she so carefully guarded wasn't hers. Elijah walked back to his seat slowly, feeling the weight of every step. His heart wasn't pounding anymore, the nervousness had melted away, replaced by a strange calm. He lowered himself into his chair, still feeling the weight of his classmates' stares. Tyler gave him a slow nod, the kind that didn't need words. Madison's arms were crossed, her gaze still fixed on Miss Thornton, as if waiting for something more. But Miss Thornton had already turned away, flipping open her lesson plan with her eyes fixed on the page, as if she could pretend nothing had happened. "Let's move on," she said, her voice stiff. The room didn't shift back to normal as quickly as she'd hoped. The energy lingered, thick in the air. People still whispered. It wasn't just about the music anymore. Brandon leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, eyeing Miss Thornton. "Kind of weird how you don't want to talk about it," he said, his voice casual, but there was an edge. "You made a big deal out of him playing, but now you're acting like it never happened." A few murmurs of agreement spread through the room. Miss Thornton's grip on her book tightened, her jaw clenching. "That's enough," she snapped, but Elijah had already seen it, the hesitation, the discomfort. And so had everyone else. For the rest of the class, Miss Thornton's usual authority seemed thin, as fragile as glass. She still controlled the lesson, but her words felt hollow. The usual rhythm of the class had broken, and the students weren't as engaged. When the bell rang, chairs scraped against the floor as the students packed up, murmuring excitedly as they filed out. Elijah slung his bag over his shoulder, heading for the door. Just before stepping into the hallway, he heard Miss Thornton call his name. "Elijah." He turned back. She looked like she might say something meaningful, something real, but instead, her expression hardened. "I hope you understand this is still my classroom." Elijah studied her for a moment, then, in the same calm, steady voice he had used all day, replied, "I know." A beat of silence passed between them before he walked out into the hallway. Tyler caught up to him, a grin tugging at his lips. "Bro, what was that?" he asked, his eyes wide. "You you flipped everything upside down." Elijah let out a breath, a small smile pulling at his lips. "Yeah, I guess I did." Tyler nudged his shoulder. "So, you gonna play again?" Elijah thought about it, the feel of the keys beneath his fingers, the music filling the room, and smiled. "Yeah, I think I will." Because today, he hadn't just played music. He had been heard. That afternoon, Elijah walked home with a lightness in his step. The sun hung low over West Markham Street, casting long shadows as he moved through the familiar route. The weight that had been pressing on him since yesterday, the tension, the doubt, was gone. At the corner store near his neighborhood, he stopped to grab a bottle of water. Mr. Henson, the older man who owned the shop, watched him with a knowing look. "You look like a kid who just did something important," Mr. Henson said with a smile. Elijah hesitated, then smiled back. "Maybe I did." By the time he reached home, the smell of fried catfish and cornbread filled the air. His mother was at the stove, humming softly as she flipped a fillet. "You're home late," she said without turning around. Elijah dropped his bag by the door and sat at the kitchen table. "Had a long day?" His mother glanced over her shoulder. "Good or bad?" He thought about it, about the way the room had gone quiet, about the way Miss Thornton had looked at him, about how his classmates had seen him differently, really seen him for the first time. "Good," he said, finally. "Really good." She turned off the burner, wiped her hands on a dish towel, and sat across from him. "Want to talk about it?" Elijah nodded. For the next 15 minutes, he told her everything. She didn't interrupt, didn't rush him. She just listened, her expression shifting between concern, pride, and something softer, almost sad. When he finished, she exhaled. "Sounds like you made her uncomfortable," she said softly. "I think I did," Elijah replied. She studied him for a moment. "And how do you feel about that?" Elijah didn't hesitate. It felt like it was supposed to happen. His mother smiled and reached across the table to squeeze his hand. "Good," she said, her voice warm. The next day at school, things were different. Not drastically, Miss Thornton still ran her class the same way, still called on the same students, still acted like nothing had changed. But the energy in the room had shifted. People saw her differently now, and they saw Elijah differently, too. During lunch, a few students who had never spoken to him before stopped by his table. "Dude, you were insane on that piano," Madison said, sitting across from him. "How long have you been playing?" she asked. "Since I was 5. Tyler shook his head. "Man, you've been holding out on us." Elijah smirked. "Guess so." From across the cafeteria, Miss Thornton walked past, tray in hand. Their eyes met briefly, but this time, she looked away first. Elijah didn't look back, he just kept eating. Because he had already said everything he needed to say. Some lessons aren't taught in books. Some moments change the way people see the world, whether they want to or not. Miss Thornton had spent the year looking past Elijah, and in just a few minutes, he had made sure she would never do it again. Maybe she would never say it out loud, maybe she would never admit what she had assumed, but it didn't matter. Because now, Elijah knew something she didn't. When people try to silence you, when they try to underestimate you, the best thing you can do is let your talent speak louder than their doubts. And when you do, they'll have no choice but to listen. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Because sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that remind us to stand tall, no matter who's watching.